Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Mladen Malkovic, founder of Partnered Solutions. After 25 years of building and operating EdTech platforms and solutions, I started Partnered with one goal: work with exceptional companies and individuals to solve some of the most pressing needs EdTech organizations have. One of the first solutions we brought to market is the Accessibility Acceleration solution we developed together with Converge Accessibility and ExcelSoft. It helps EdTech organizations meet growing legal, institutional, and student-centered demands around digital accessibility. In early conversations with EdTech leaders, one question was repeated over and over. We need a practical understanding of accessibility, from legal requirements to institutional compliance, and what it means for business risks and opportunities. This webcast series and our accompanying newsletter is intended to do exactly that. We'll unpack the legal landscape first, then cover implications for institutions and EdTech organizations, and share practical steps to minimize risk and maximize your opportunities. Along the way, you can submit any additional questions you might have, and we'll answer them in our dedicated EdTech Leadership Q&A webcasts. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get started. In this first series of episodes, we are zeroing on the legal perspective because that's where the urgency is building fastest. We'll cover this in 3 separate webcasts. First will be federal laws and enforcement, which will focus on what are now requirements under ADA and the timelines. The second webcast will be around state-level legislation and enablement, which will be focused on how states are adapting and what that means for procurement, partnerships, and platform compliance. And the third part will be focused on answering all the top questions from EdTech leaders, and that will be in a Q&A format. And we will be inviting you to provide your questions as part of these webcasts. For all 3 webcasts, I am truly honored to be joined by Ken Nakata, a nationally recognized legal expert in digital accessibility, former DOJ attorney, and principal at Converge Accessibility. So Ken, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Before we dive into federal enforcement, could you take a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your journey in accessibility, your work at Converge Accessibility, and how your legal expertise is helping education and EdTech companies these days.
Absolutely, and thank you again, Mladen. My journey in accessibility really started in 1992 when the ADA was first passed. And I started at the Justice Department in the office that eventually became the Disability Rights Section, which is the office that is responsible for enforcing and setting policy under the Americans with Disabilities Act. During the first half of my career, I really focused on traditional elements of accessibility, like built environment accessibility. And then during the second half of my career, I really focused on digital accessibility with the passage of Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And at that time, I helped the federal government in making their technologies accessible under Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, and represented the Justice Department in rulemakings and in interagency working groups between all the federal agencies to try to ensure that their technology was accessible. After I left the Justice Department, I worked in digital accessibility at a number of firms before starting our own firm, which is Converge Accessibility, back in 2020. And now I'm one of the 2 principals of the company, along with my business partner, Jeff Singleton. And we focus on digital accessibility, but also just general accessibility from a slightly broader perspective than most of the other digital consulting firms. Sure, we do testing and the technical elements of it, but we also help organizations really understand and meet the legal requirements, because often the legal requirements are sometimes easier to meet and they are more of a people problem than just a technical problem. And ultimately, while the law talks about conforming with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which may sound like just a technical problem, at the end of the day, it really is a people problem.
That's a very nice thought, and I'm sure we're going to talk about technology and legal and people sides of this a lot today. So let's get going with the first question. What does the new ADA Title II rule actually requires K-12 schools and universities to do?
Well, it applies to public entities. So that involves state and local government entities. And that means it also applies to things like school districts, public universities, community colleges, any instrumentality of the state. It doesn't just apply to educational facilities. It applies just generally to any that's run by the state. And it requires that any website or web applications that are used by those organizations, that they have to meet what's called the WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, version 2.1, level A and double A. Now, these are a set of guidelines that are created by the World Wide Web Consortium, and they set the standard on what does something have to look like in order to be accessible. So I said that it covers web applications and mobile applications, but really for a college or a K through 12 or any educational facility, that would mean it includes their website as well as their learning management systems, their courseware, digital documents that are posted on their mobile site or they're available through mobile applications, and any kind of other applications that might be considered a program, service, or activity of that institution. So it doesn't just cover the courseware, but it would also cover their main website or student services or student activities or even things that aren't necessarily related to students, things that are just generally made available through the website or through mobile apps for an educational entity. The deadlines are April 24th, basically, but it depends on 2026 if it's for any organization that serves a population of over 50,000 people, and April 27 for smaller ones, so less than 50,000. That's the general rule. There are special rules for what they call special district governments, but that's for things like, water authorities or electrical authorities and things like that. In general, you have to comply with WCAG 2.1A and AA, which is a pretty strict set of standards. I'm not going to sugarcoat it in any way. It is very difficult to meet those standards. So the Justice Department really did put us in a very difficult position. And it has to be fully met unless you can fall within one of several defenses. Some of those defenses traditionally have been very difficult to meet under the law, but again, I think that the Justice Department put us in this position, so we're going to have to get somewhat creative with some of them. The exemptions that are specifically stated, there's a separate paragraph for, are pretty narrow. It includes things that are like archived before the effective date of the requirements, pre-existing social media posts, and things like that. Uh, Enforcement is also going to start immediately upon that April 24th deadline, either 2026 or 2027, depending upon your size. And at that point, there are two things that educational institutions have to worry about. One is a private complaint or a private lawsuit filed by a student or their families. But I think the more likely thing that will happen is a complaint by the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Education. These complaints are very easy to file with the agency, and the OCR is required to go and investigate them. Another possibility is even an investigation by the Department of Justice, although the Department of Justice is much more picky about the types of complaints that they're going to actually go and investigate. But if it ends up in litigation, then it would definitely be the Department of Justice because OCR refers matters to DOJ for litigation. Now, there's some useful information that's currently out there for organizations that are trying to achieve digital accessibility. And one of them is a document by the Department of Justice on first steps for complying with the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II Web and Mobile Application Accessibility Rule. That sets forth some guidance that I think is very consistent with the advice that most of the consultants are suggesting that state and local governments follow.
So thank you, Ken. Sounds like with all that is expected of the schools, they all must be working really hard getting ready. We're actually planning to cover that and talk to a couple of members of the institutions and learn firsthand where are they in that process. Another question I have is about WCAG 2.1 AA. How did it go from specification and standard to a law?
Before DOJ issued its new regulation, they had been using WCAG 2.1 as a standard to use in their different settlement agreements. So they did have some familiarity with it. There wasn't anything before that, however, that specifically required it. And now the new standard specifically points to 2.1 as the yardstick against which they're going to measure compliance with the ADA accessibility rule. Now, WCAG 2.1A and AA has a number of advantages over other standards. One of the most important one, though, is that it's so widely adopted and recognized by other governmental organizations. It's widely adopted at the federal level. It's included also in the HHS regulation and in the DOT regulation for web applications. It's also used by a ton of states as part of their digital accessibility efforts. But I think most importantly, it was also the international yardstick for measuring digital accessibility. Now, it can be maddeningly frustrating to work with, but it does provide a clear and testable standard if you dig into the requirements. It's also agnostic and pretty comprehensive. It covers what text designers and copy authors and developers, graphics and media people. It covers all of those different roles that are part of the software development lifecycle. Also includes, test criteria and test procedures. It really is something that can be implemented and rolled out across the whole SDLC. It also supports a lot of different devices. So as our culture has moved towards mobile technologies, it incorporates that as well. Particularly the 2.1 standards were really brought in to include mobile accessibility. It covers areas like cognitive disabilities and learning disabilities. Frequent criticism of WCAG is that it could have gone further, and maybe new editions of WCAG will cover that more thoroughly. But it does do a pretty good job at starting down the road on those issues. I should also mention with WCAG, in anything in the 2.x series, they are generally always backward compatible. So the 2.1 series is consistent and harmonized with the 2.0. There's even a WCAG 2.2, which is harmonized with 2.1 and 2.0. There is a WCAG 2.30, which isn't backward compatible with the 2 series, but it's going to be, gosh, probably a decade before we see 3.0 hit the market. So 2.1 really is the standard that everybody should be looking at. Because it's such an international standard and because so many people are normalized to it, building to WCAG 2.1 will reduce overall legal risk. It also makes sense from a business perspective, even though the 2.2 is out there, the delta between 2.2 and 2.1 is really, really small, and nobody is ever going to end up litigating, as far as I believe, over those differences. So definitely 2.1 is the thing you want to shoot for, and then maybe down the road incorporate 2.2, but it will be a simple add-on as opposed to changing your processes. But I think, most importantly, if you build to any of those standards, you really are improving all user experience. And it's not just for people with disabilities. Sure, people with disabilities are a primary beneficiary, but really, people say that after they design for accessibility, it just is a better user experience overall.
Sounds like the WCAG choice was really an important factor. It will help us scale this, and it will help EdTech organizations better predict and manage their business and legal risks. Thank you for expanding on that important question for us. And another question about federal level laws is how are they starting to impact EdTech vendor deals with institutions? What are you seeing out there?
Well, now accessibility really is becoming a mandate on edtech vendors and all vendors of web and mobile applications. And so we can see this as part of the procurement process in a couple of really important ways. At the very minimum, institutions are now asking for solid VPATs. A VPAT is a voluntary product accessibility template, or ACR, which stands for an accessibility conformance report. These are tools that basically outline how a product meets each of the different WCAG requirements. And so now educational institutions are asking vendors to create VPATs and ACRs, and they're stating that in their RFPs. And now they're actually looking at them more seriously. So previously, vendors would just fill out a VPAT and say that they support every WCAG requirement, even though they really didn't do it. And they just think of it as a marketing exercise. And now people are actually looking at them seriously and saying to themselves that if you did that, then chances are you really don't understand accessibility and you really didn't take it seriously. So they're looking at poorly filled out VPATs as a way of disqualifying or at least questioning vendors much more seriously. And well, and if those VPATs are filled out incorrectly and an educational institution relies on them, it now is even triggering potential legal liability. And we can see that particularly in Colorado, where they just passed a new law about that. Um, and consequently, they're also looking at those VPATs with a lot more scrutiny, and they're also beginning to audit them to make sure that, that you actually filled it out correctly. That information is now being shared between different organizations. So if one school district has a bad experience with a vendor, word gets around between them because everybody's trying to achieve this thing called digital accessibility. And so they're sharing the testing results that they get when they scrutinize a VPAT. So if you don't take it seriously, it's a pretty quick way of getting yourself blacklisted by an entire range of educational institutions within a state. They're also asking edtech vendors to demonstrate their accessibility. So that requires a certain amount of expertise. They're actually expecting vendors to demonstrate how their product works in the use case scenarios that they're buying that product for using assistive technology like a screen reader. So if you're producing courseware, for instance, you may be expected to show using NVDA or JAWS how that content actually reads out to a person who's blind, who's using a screen reader. Um, Now, obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into making stuff accessible. And a lot of vendors, the reality is it's going to take them a lot of time to make their stuff accessible. Well, that's fine. So, what local government institutions are doing now is that they're asking in that situation to tell them what your full digital accessibility roadmap looks like. When are you going to focus on specific types of barriers? When do you expect to remove them? How do you plan to roll them out to your users? And then they're also asking you to make fixes and respond to user feedback, particularly users with disabilities, in order to keep ramping up the level of accessibility. The thing about WCAG that has to be remembered is that it's a very difficult to meet standard. And right now, basically no products out there fully meet WCAG 2.1A and AA. It's like a goal that everybody has to just keep trying and trying to close the gap between where they are and this really high standard. And so state and local government institutions and school districts and universities are expecting vendors to just keep continuing to fill that void and close that gap. And if your competitor is closing that gap faster than you're closing the gap, then they can use that as a basis for switching their technologies.
That was a really comprehensive overview. So it sounds like with April 26th deadline that we all need to think of accessibility compliance same way we've been conditioned to think about security and privacy compliance. And earlier you mentioned OCR, and I think it would be very interesting to understand how does OCR fit into this larger federal level picture?
Oh, that's a great question, Mladen, and it's something we should definitely cover. So when we say OCR, we're talking about the Office of Civil Rights. They're probably the biggest and most important player for EdTech vendors when it comes to this new Title II web accessibility rule. And I think it's important to go over some of the reasons why that's the case. First, OCR only handles education related complaints. They're a specialized investigation and enforcement agency within a very specialized agency. One of the things that sets OCR complaints apart from, say, Department of Justice complaints is that OCR complaints can be filed by anyone. And so that can include people that are directly affected by courseware, directly affected by a website, or it can include people that aren't affected by that courseware or a website just because they know about a potential violation or have reason to know about a violation. Now, because of that, together with the fact that there's a requirement in the Department of Education's regulations that require them to investigate thoroughly every complaint that raises a colorable claim of a potential violation of anti-discrimination laws. So what that means is that if there's a complaint that's filed and if you just on the basis of that complaint, you would say, well, yeah, if everything that they allege is true, then it's a violation of civil rights laws. They're required to go and investigate it. Organizations like the Department of Justice, that's not true. They very much cherry pick the types of investigations that they're going to launch. So consequently, it's much easier to start an OCR investigation. They're also much faster, admittedly, than DOJ investigations because their procedure manual requires them to complete them within a much shorter time frame. Because they process so many of these complaints, and there are, I believe, over 4,000 web accessibility complaints that are still outstanding that they're investigating, they need to follow a much more rigid timeline and schedule, and they follow a very predictable process. So in general, it's much, much more likely that an educational institution is going to get investigated by OCR than facing a private lawsuit under Title II or a DOJ investigation. At the end of an OCR investigation, there are a couple different possible outcomes, but the most likely one is voluntary resolution agreement that identifies, certain things that the organization has to do, like certain measures it has to take to eliminate or mitigate the harm, as well as reporting or monitoring to show how you're keeping in compliance with that agreement. And often, in fact, I'd say usually, if it involves technology, that resolution agreement is going to involve the ad tech vendor who created the inaccessible technology. Now, you probably have heard different things about the administration and what's going on over at OCR. And while all of that is embroiled in politics, and we'll cover that later, the important point for now is that even though that's happening, the overall priorities and process are pretty much staying the same from the way in which they did it in previous administrations. It's a model that they just consistently follow no matter who's in the White House.
As EdTech vendors, we're facing increasing likelihood of being investigated by OCR together with our institutional clients. and especially if our products may be identified in those complaints. So it's good to know who OCR is and what they do. And what can you share with us about web accessibility case levels at federal courts now and in the future? What trends do you see developing?
That's a great question also. There's a lot of litigation involving web accessibility. Web accessibility is easily the fastest growing area of litigation under the ADA and other disability rights laws like the California UNRRA Act. Now, almost all of those lawsuits involve private sector entities. A few of them involve colleges and universities, but most of them haven't involved education, quite frankly. But that's because they haven't had very clear regulations until now. Now, with the ADA Title II web accessibility rule, there's a very specific measure, which is WCAG 2.1a and AA, that's used in it. And so that is coming into effect in April 2026. I think that we are going to be seeing a lot more complaints involving web accessibility with the Justice Department and with OCR. And we'll also be seeing more litigation in federal court against educational institutions, state and local governments. Yeah, they're going to be facing a lot more likelihood of litigation. But what about the vendors? I don't think that there are going to be terribly many lawsuits against EdTech vendors after the Title II web accessibility rule comes into effect. It's because EdTech vendors aren't state or local government entities, so they're not specifically covered by Title II of the ADA. But if one of their clients gets sued, you can bet your boots that the vendor is going to be identified in all the press that comes out around that litigation. And it may as well be that they were sued because the loss of goodwill that the organization is going to suffer with all the rest of their clients who rely on their technology is going to be such that you can very quickly become persona non grata because you're selling inaccessible technology. So it's a substantial impact, I would say, on edtech vendors. I think that actually some of them may end up getting sued by national disability organizations. But whether that's probably not under the ADA, it'll probably be under different civil rights laws. But when that happens, even if the legal basis isn't particularly strong, like if they were sued by a national disability rights group, the publicity is always there. And we've seen that time and again when private sector organizations are sued by, say, National Federation of the Blind or American Federation of the Blind. It's a real black eye to that organization, even if it doesn't end up being much at the end of the day in court.
That's a really good perspective. Sounds like we're really going to see an increasing risk for loss of credibility, not as much as lawsuits after the mandate comes into effect. And so, last question we have on the federal perspective is really relating to the current administration. Is the web accessibility in the education one of the priorities for the current administration? What are you seeing out there?
Yes. Well, the short answer is yes. And I'm glad you asked that question because it's easily one of the top three questions I get asked just about every day. And it's something that I think people have legitimate reasons to ask it because of all the things that we've been seeing. So I'd say that in general, there are signs both ways. There are clear signs like the Department of Energy recently issued a notice that was going to issue what's called a direct final rule, which is a fast track regulation. And that would revoke the new construction requirements under Section 504. So that sounds like a mouthful, but basically what it is it's a requirement to make buildings and things like that and facilities meet and ramps and entrances in buildings that receive federal funding. It would take away the requirement to make them accessible. And that got so much blowback from the disability community that the administration decided to put that effort on pause. So that's one sign suggesting that things are going to end up being negative. directly affected. On the other hand, we've had cases from the disability rights section, like the recent Uber complaint, that could just as easily have been filed during the Obama or the Biden administrations. They're very aggressive digital rights, civil rights complaints. On the other hand, the disability rights section said that they expect within the next 6 months to be issuing a notice of proposed rulemaking to possibly limit or minimize the impact, I should say, of the new digital rule that's coming into effect in April of next year. Yet, on the other hand, we've heard from inside the federal government that won't be nearly as impactful on the current regulations. So basically, the overall requirements, timing, and structure remain unchanged. But what I can tell you, though, so you've got signs going both ways. What I can say, though, is as someone who's worked through both Republican and Democratic administrations in the disability rights section, one of the things that I noticed is that disability rights are treated fundamentally differently than other areas of civil rights. What that means is that while other sections in the civil rights divisions were dramatically affected by changes of administration, disability rights kept going fairly consistently. I think it's really important to remember that the ADA was passed not by a Democrat, it was passed by a Republican. And that makes a difference. It has always been treated differently from other civil rights areas. So, with the rule that's coming into effect in April, I'd say don't expect a sudden change of that regulation. In one way or another, it's going to come around and it's going to, in all likelihood, be exactly what we're looking at right now. So the sooner organizations start preparing for that, the better.
Oh, thank you, Ken. I do share the perspective that accessibility education is and should remain priority for all of us because it does impact a huge percentage of kids in schools and families across entire America. So let's have a little recap of the federal level perspective. So it sounds like the mandate is very clear and the specification is also very clear, and both of them coming to effect in April 26. And I think, Ken, you helped us understand that institutions are responsible for ensuring compliance. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's the educational institution that is required to comply with this.
And I think from my perspective, this also feels like a significant mind shift. We all need to think about accessibility as one of the requirements that are equally mandated, like security and privacy in our industry. I think we also learned about OCR, that is the name we should all know and be aware of, as they are the most likely federal agency that may be investigating and approaching us to ask about our products. Ken, do they call? Do they send a letter? Like, how do they reach out?
Yeah, usually it's by a letter. And for, depending upon who you are, that can be a very scary letter.
Okay, so not answering phone calls is not going to work. We talked a little bit about court cases in federal courts. Obviously, expecting there will be an increase in them with the mandate coming into effect on 26. I think we also touched on expectation and the signs that this is going to continue being a priority in terms of enforcement and legislation because it impacts everyone in America. And that was a constant across different administrations over time. And it sounds like to me, if I'm to wrap it up, is that really what's changing, the biggest change is that from April 26, there is a clear federal law with a clear specification mandating this, and that is going to impact both RFP and legal mechanisms that will be used to help institutions, help states comply with this important federal law. And thank you for helping us unpack this federal legal landscape, especially the implications on institutions and EdTech companies. For everyone watching, this is more than compliance. It's about access to education for millions of students and the expectations placed on the platforms and partners that serve them. If you're EdTech leader, the key takeaways is your products, if used by public institutions, must meet WCAG 2.1 AA by April 26. There's time to act, but window for proactive planning is closing fast. In the next webcast, we'll look at the state level picture, how state laws, programs, education departments, and procurement frameworks are enabling accessibility efforts beyond federal mandates. Until then, all the best, and Ken, thank you again.